We begin this week's Parsha podcast with a very exciting announcement. We have been renewed. Yes, it's true. We've been renewed for year 9. We, of course, are beginning the stretch run of year 8 of the Parsha podcast. And please God, with the help of the Almighty, and thanks to your dedicated listenership, and of course, thanks to your wonderful support, all of our friends, all of our partners who support the great work of Torch and the Torch Center in Houston, Texas, and the Parsha podcast, we will be, please God, renewing the Parsha podcast for year 9. And I have to say, it was a bit of a tough sell to the powers that be. The skeptics were all out. The naysayers. They were saying, why do we need another season? Isn't 8 years of the Parsha podcast enough? That's longer than medical school and residency. How much more is there to talk about? How much more is there to say? But of course, with the help of the Almighty, we succeeded in persuading them to renew the Parsha podcast for yet another season. It is so exciting, and I'm very happy to reveal to you the new theme. In the early years of the Parsha podcast, we didn't really do themes. We didn't either have any excellent audio. It's kind of harsh on the ears. But over the course of the years of the Parsha podcast, we did one year, we call it the rebroadcast, which we cover the whole Parsha in about an hour. And then we had the A and Q. You remember the A and Q? That was a theme a couple of years ago. It was an answer and a question. It was a segment at the end of the show where I would give you the question and I would solicit answers from the audience. And then we had the exquisite insight, like a mind-blowing, mind-bending insight at the end of the show. And last year we had Raise Your Parsha IQ, an idea and a question. And the tagline was that Torah is the only thing that is documented to raise your intelligence. And of course, year 8, it's been dad deep and deeper to go beneath the surface, behind the veneer, to probe deep and deeper. And now we have a plan for year 9. Please God. Drum roll, please. Year 9 of the Parsha podcast. The theme is going to be, please God, Torah is your ID. It's your identification. Our sages tell us that our nation is only a nation because of its Torah. The Almighty chose us from all the other nations and gave us His Torah. When did we become a nation? At Sinai, with the giving of the Torah. What exemplifies us as a people? What defines us? What is our ID? It's the Torah. Please God, next year, every podcast will have an idea, and a dilemma. In year 9, please God, every episode will have 2 segments, an idea and a dilemma, some sort of problem, some sort of situation that can create maybe fodder for a discussion, maybe even around a Shabbos table. So many listeners have told me that they shared the ideas that we discussed in the Parsha podcast at their Shabbos table. And this segment, the dilemma segment, please God, of next year's slate of Parsha podcasts is designed to spur conversation, a dilemma that relates to the Parsha, all the while remembering that our ID is the Torah. It's our passport to heaven. It's our driver's license accompanying us on our journey through life. And as a Texan, I would be remiss if I would not suggest it's our license to carry. It's going to protect us as we progress through life. It's who we are. It's how we identify. And please God, year 9 of the Parsha podcast will be a wonderful year of Torah study, week after week together from the Torch Center in Houston, Texas, and wherever life may bring us. Thanks to y'all. Thanks, of course, to the Almighty. Thank you for your wonderful support and your wonderful friendship. It's been a wild ride. I've enjoyed every moment of it, but we have a plan. We have a theme. Torah is your ID. I'm really excited for year 9 of the Parsha podcast, please God. But we still have a few months. Until then, we're still in year 8. And our pledge is to go deep and deeper. And we have a new book. The book of Devarim. Parsha's Devarim. The book of Deuteronomy. Let us begin. This book details, or it begins with, Moshe's speech to the nation. We're about a month away from the end of Moshe's life, and he is sharing a message, a parting message to the people. And it begins, these are the words that Moshe spoke, El Kol Yisrael, to all of Israel, Be'evar Yarden, on the other side of the Jordan, on the Trans-Jordan, Bamidbar, in the wilderness, Ba'arava, in the plain, opposite Soph, between Paran and Tophel and Lavan and Chatzeros and Dizav. It's a very wordy first verse. And of course, Rashi tells us that these locations, it's very hard to pinpoint what the verse is telling us on a simple level. These places, many of them, they don't even appear in all of Scripture. These are not real places, but these are hints of all the different places and all the different venues in which the nation blundered, in which the nation sinned. And Moshe is trying to give a subtle criticism to the nation. Moshe refrained from criticizing, from reprimanding, from castigating the nation for the duration of his life. Now he's on his deathbed, so to speak. In 30 or so days, he's going to pass, and he wants to give some constructive criticism to the people before he departs. And he, Rashi tells us in these cryptic words, he is invoking some of the various different sins that the nation committed over the course of the preceding 40 years, with the manna, with the spies, with the complaint, if only we died in Egypt, with the sins in the plains of Moab, with the daughters of Moab, when they committed the sin at the advice of Bilam, with the women, they were seduced, and they did the idolatry with Baal Peor, when they complained at the splitting of the sea, with the insurrection of Korach, with, of course, the sin of the golden calf. This is a very short speech, just verse number 1 of our Parsha of our book, but it's a subtle and delicate form of rebuke. Moshe is reprimanding the nation. He's not aggressively pointing out their flaws. He's talking about locations, but these locations are not really names of places, but invocations of their sins. And the names of places are pseudonyms for their sins. That's how the parsha begins. And Moshe proceeds to offer a sweeping overview of the events of the previous 40 years. And this speech takes up the whole parsha and all of next week's parsha. And it's absolute stunning retrospective of the previous years, a masterpiece. Moshe is weaving in the events of the past, and he's talking about the consequences of their previous misdeeds and what lessons ought to be learned and what ways they could take to avoid future mistakes. In this speech, we see more details to previous events that we've not quite known in the past. But I want to focus on, in this week's Parsha podcast, Year 8 of the Parsha podcast. I want to focus on one event that Moshe spends a lot of time detailing in our Parsha, and that is the episode of the spies. From chapter 1, verse 22, all the way through the end of chapter 1, 24 verses later, Moshe recounts the events of the spies, of the scouts that were sent to go inspect the land, and they came back with a slanderous report, and they deflated the nation, and the nation said, let's go back to Egypt. And as a result of this sin, the nation was condemned to spend 40 years in the wilderness. The scouting of the land was a 40-day enterprise. Every day results in 1 year being in the wilderness. Now, I will add that this is very topical to the time of year, because the day where the spies came back to the people, to the camp, and offered their slanderous report, that was the 9th day of the month of Av. And Rashi tell us that day became designated for all sorts of tragedies, and the cause for all the calamities of that day is the sin of the spies. When the spies came back and gave their report, people started bewailing and crying and sobbing. The whole night they're crying. Oh, we're all going to die. It's going to be a disaster. Let's go back to Egypt. And the Talmud tells us that the Almighty said regarding this display of misery and crying, you want to cry for no reason? If you cry needlessly on this day, I will give you sufficient reason to cry. The first temple was built and was destroyed on the 9th day of the month of Av. The second temple was also destroyed on the 9th of Av. The liquidation of the city of Beitar, which led to 1 million Jewish casualties, that was on this day. Because the people cried needlessly. Because they accepted the slanderous report of the spies, hook, line, and sinker. As a result, this day became designated for tragedy and misfortune. And this day is next week. It's, of course, the 9th day of Av. It's one of 2 fast days that are 24-hour fast days, really 26, because you cover a little bit more on either side. It's a day that we mourn what we lost and hope to do what we can to reclaim and recoup the greatness that we had in the past. So Moshe recounts the events of the spies in our Parsha, and it's fascinating to see how it is presented now versus how it was originally presented in Parshas Shlach in the book of Numbers. So let's go deep. Nay, let's go deep and deeper into the episode of the spies as recounted in our Parsha. So first things, if you look at how Moshe presents what happened, it's very, very interesting to see what he says. Verse 22, he says, all of you came and you said, let us send spies to go inspect the land and let them come back and tell us which is the proper way to enter the land. And I thought it was a good idea. And we selected 12 men, one from each tribe, and they ascended the mountain and they inspected the land. They scouted out the land and they brought back from the fruits of the land, and they came and they responded to us. They told us the message, the land is very good. But you refused to listen and you wanted to stay in the wilderness or go back to Egypt. So the commentaries all note that if you read the story when it actually happened in chapter 13 of Numbers, it seems like Moshe is telling a different story. In the original episode, we read how the spies said the land is very terrible, a land that consumes its inhabitants, a land in which if we enter we'll all be slaughtered. Oh, and there was also Joshua and Caleb. They said, no, the land's very good, we have to go into it. But here, Moshe buries the lead. He omits the whole part of the message of the spies where they said that it's a terrible place and we're all going to die. In the actual story, 10 of the 12 said that we should go back to Egypt. It's unconquerable. But now when Moshe retells the story, he omits that. And he says, well, the spies said that it's very good. So Rashi tells us the spies, well, that's Joshua and Caleb. That's 2 of the 12 spies. But, continues Moshe, you didn't listen to them. And that's the criticism that Moshe is offering of the people. Moshe is criticizing the nation for not listening to the spies, i.e., not listening to Joshua and Caleb, who said the land is very good. So the obvious question that everyone asks over here is, well, how could you blame us for listening to 10 of the spies and not to 2? Those 2, Joshua and Caleb, were contradicted by the other 10. Why are they to blame for favoring the majority over the minority? Interesting question. So there's a few answers, and we've given answers to this question in the past. The Maharal says, these 2, Joshua and Caleb, they should have more credibility than the other 10. Why? Because these 2, their claim is falsifiable. Joshua and Caleb are arguing to enter the land. What happens if we listen to them? Well, then, if they are lying, they will be disproven. So they're willing to say, follow us, and then you'll know for sure that we're telling the truth. Whereas the other 10, they're arguing that the land is bad and we shouldn't enter. Well, what happens if we listen to them? We don't enter, and we never discover whether or not what they're saying is true or not. So their position, their argument is not falsifiable, and thus, argues Moshe, those 2 have more credibility, and they should be believed over the other 10. There's another idea that the commentaries suggest as to why Joshua and Caleb had more credibility. The spies, we learn, they did not want to enter the land because they thought that they would have to forfeit their leadership positions once the nation enters the land. And thus, all 12 spies, all of these 12 leaders, they were biased to favor the status quo and to maintain their leadership position. Therefore, Joshua and Caleb, who argued for the path that amounted to them losing their prominence, they ought to be more believable than the other 10 who argued for the path that was beneficial to them. Meaning 2 people arguing against their bias should outweigh 10 arguing for their bias. So I think this is just an interesting idea, a deep insight to get us started as to why Joshua and Caleb ought to have more believability, more credibility in the eyes of the populace than the other 10. Because after all, 12 people were sent in to inspect the land, and the masses don't know who to believe. They weren't there. And 10 say, we'll all get slaughtered if we enter. And 2 of them say, no, we should enter and we'll carve them up like bread. So ordinarily you would say the majority should hold more sway over the minority. 10 is more believable than 2. And here, for 2 reasons, Joshua and Caleb ought to be more believed, either because their position is falsifiable and therefore should carry more weight than the unfalsifiable stance, or because their position would lead to a downgrade in their status, and they state it nonetheless. Therefore, it ought to have more credibility. But I think there's an overarching takeaway over here. The nation's being criticized. You did not listen to the spies, i.e. to Joshua and Caleb. You should have made that calculation that Joshua and Caleb are more believable. And the fact that you did not listen to them, that is a stain on your record. Moshe is telling us, Torah is telling us, that they should have done that calculation. They should have understood that Joshua and Caleb are more believable, even though they're only 2 over the 10. Again, this is just a warm-up segment. Let's go to segment number 2. The people did not listen to Joshua and Caleb. You refused to go, says Moshe, chapter 1, verse 26. And you flouted the commandment of your God. And you sulked in your tents. And you said, what do people say? It's because God hates us that he brought us out of the land of Egypt. The people claimed that the reason why God took them out of Egypt is because he hated them. That's a very startling claim. This is the nation of God. The nation that at the time of the spies, they had witnessed incredible miracles. And all those miracles would seem to suggest that God loves them. They had the Exodus and the plagues and the splitting of the sea, and they were eating manna and drinking water from a rock. They had the war against Amalek, the Sinai revelation. They are ensconced and enveloped by clouds of glory. There is so much evidence to suggest that God loves them. Yet in verse 27, they claim, falsely, baselessly, that he hated them. Very interesting. It gets more interesting when we look at Rashi. Bisinas Hashem osanu, they're saying that Hashem hates us. Says Rashi. V'hu, and God, haya ohev eschem. He loved you. You say God hates you. Truth is, God loves you. But you hate him. Very, very interesting comment here in Rashi, in verse 27. The verse says that the people said that God hates us. But the truth is, says Rashi, it's the opposite. He loves you. And he loved you at the time. But you hated him. Now, if you read this Rashi, Rashi's making a very bold claim. He's saying that the people hated God, and that's why they said God hated them. How does Rashi know this? How does Rashi know that the reason why we said that he hates us is because we actually hated him? And the Maharal says something very, very powerful. If the people did not hate God, there would be no way to imagine that he hates them. The relationship that we have with God, or that he has towards us, is like that of a parent and a child. Hashem, we're told, is our father. And parents naturally love their children with an irrational and irresistible love. Non-parents don't know what this means. There's no other love that quite matches it. And God loves us as a parent loves a child. My grandfather, of blessed memory, used to say that the reason why the world was designed in such a way that new children are spawned by parents, like why is there this system that parents have children? It's to give us an image, a glimpse into how the Almighty feels towards us. Someone who's privileged enough to be a parent, you have a little bit of an insight as to how God feels towards you. God loves us like a parent. Everything that he does is for our benefit. And of course, sometimes it's hard to see that. Sometimes parents, because of their love for their child, they do things to the child that the child interprets as hatred. The classic example of this is the child's making a beeline towards a busy thoroughfare, and the parent lunges and tackles the child into the pavement. And the kid interprets that, well, my parent hates me. But actually, that was a sign of the parent's love towards you. God sometimes strikes us for our benefit. And it's because he loves us completely. And again, the closest way for us to imagine this is to simulate the love that we have for our children and to realize that that's the love, that's a measure, a scintilla of the love that God has towards us. You know, my kids and I have a competition. My two older boys, thank God, they're big, tall kids, both over 6 feet tall, but not quite as tall as Dad. And they want nothing more than to be taller than me. And they make it a competition. So whenever we take a family photo, they're always like stretching their neck and putting on Texas boots to get just a little bit taller to maybe be taller than Dad. And I always tell them, listen, that there's no competition. I want you to be better than me in every possible way. Be taller and more handsome and more successful. That brings me joy. There's no adversarial relationship. A parent, again, assuming everyone's healthy here, a parent is never envious of their child. They love them. They love them deeply. They love them in a way that a child cannot love a parent. And the child's success brings a parent deep internal joy. That feeling is natural. And again, the reason why the Almighty designed the world in such a fashion is so we can have a small glimpse into the way God feels towards us. And here the people say something very, very harsh. God hates us. And Rashi reveals to us that is a bunch of bunk. The truth is, he loves us. And it's evident in everything that he does towards us. And the only way we can miss it, it's only if we hate him. This is very harsh, what Rashi is telling us. But I think it's very sobering. We have a mitzvah to love God, no matter what. Even if he takes our life. Obviously, if a person's placed in such a situation, such a circumstance, it's very hard for them to love God. But our lack of love towards God can cause us to misinterpret his love towards us as hate. I think it's a very deep and very sobering insight, and one that I think is very germane to the time of year that we're dealing with now. And next week is Tisha B'Av, as we shall talk about in just a little bit. And that's a day that most symbolizes the terrible things that have befallen our people. And we always say, well, where's God? Why is God doing this to us? Why are all these terrible things befalling us? And that happens, it's a feeling that we may have as individuals, and it's certainly a feeling that our nation as a collective can potentially lapse into. And the truth is, if we love God, we'll be able to witness his love towards us in a more palpable fashion. Everything that he does, it's only because he loves us. And again, it's hard for us to appreciate that sometimes. But that's the truth. And only if we don't have sufficient love for him can we misinterpret the things that he does to us as signs of his hatred towards us. It's not true. He loves us. But if we don't love him sufficiently, we can make that misinterpretation. Let's move on to segment number 3. Parshas Devarim is always read right before Tisha B'Av. And again, the sin of the spies happened on Tisha B'Av, and they're connected. The day that the spies came back with their slanderous report, it was the 9th day of the month of Av. And that's the cause, our sages tell us, of this inauspicious day's calamities. You cried needlessly on this day. Chapter 14, verse 1 of Numbers. On this day, on this night, the nation just wept. And the Midrash tells us, the Almighty says, so to speak, you cried needlessly. I will designate this day as a day of crying. And from that moment, it was decreed that the temple be destroyed, that Jewish people be sent into exile. There's a causal relationship between the sin of the spies and the terrible events that happen on Tisha B'Av. What is the connection between the spies, the event of the spies, and Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av? If the sin of the spies was the cause for Tisha B'Av, for the 9th day of Av, for the destruction of the temple, for the exile of the people, it must be that there's a causal relationship between the two. And if we want to undo all the terrible symptoms of exile, of destruction, we have to understand the underlying cause of the destruction. And the roots of it all lie in the sin of the spies. What's the connection? On a very basic level, of course, it's obvious. The spies come with a report. It's terrifying. People say, we don't want to go into the land. We don't want to enter it. We're scared. We're terrified. Let's go back to Egypt. Or let us at least remain in the wilderness. The sin of the spies amounted to a rejection of the land. The people didn't want to enter. They were too scared. They couldn't handle it. You don't want the land? Okay. You'll get what you want. You will be booted from the land. You'll lose the temple inside the land. You'll be plunged into exile from this land that you sobbed about entering. You needlessly sobbed against entering. You'll have a very good cause to sob when you are booted from this land. That's, I think, on a very basic level, the connection between the sin of the spies and the terrible calamities that befell our people on the 9th day of Av. I want to suggest something that may be a bit deeper. The first letter in the Torah, Bereshis, it's a letter Bet, a letter Beis. And the Midrash asks the question, why not start with the first letter? with the letter Aleph. Aleph is 1, Bet is to start with 1. So the Midrash gives a variety of answers. And one of the answers is because the creation of the world was like the letter Bet. Bet is number 2. And the creation of the world was twofold. 2 worlds were created simultaneously. Olam hazeh, this world, and Olam haba, the next world. These worlds, these 2 worlds, are fundamentally different. This world is visible, is physical, is material. The next world, the other world, is invisible, is spiritual. This world is temporary. The world to come is enduring. This world is the world where the body reigns supreme. The other world is the world of the soul. The other world is the world where it's undeniable that God is the only power. In this world, God's power is masked, is obscured by cause and effect, by the veneer of the physical reality. In this world, people and forces and rules of nature, they carry weight. They have assumed power. The creation, it was a twofold creation. One world that we see, that we inhabit, and the other world that we cannot see, that we potentially can have no connection with. And all of life, all of free will, the whole enterprise, it's all a question of which world to optimize for. The fundamental question that we have to choose in our life is which world, which of these 2 worlds, the visible or the invisible, the body or the soul, which one to prioritize. A mitzvah, by definition, is a decision optimized for the benefit of the soul, optimized for the world that we call heaven, for that invisible world. A sin, by definition, is a decision that redounds to the detriment of the soul. And many people, maybe even most people, they live a life that they are completely unaware, completely oblivious about this other world. Most people live lives that are not at all aligned with the interests of the soul and not optimized for the world of the soul. And our life objective, the purpose of our life, and the goal towards which we were given Torah, it's to become citizens of the spiritual world, to optimize for the spiritual world, to favor the soul over the body, to favor our permanent selves over our temporary, transient selves, to try to become more spiritually oriented and less physically oriented, to hopefully view the physical reality as just a garb, a veneer, a facade, to view this world as a corridor, as a means to acquire the world to come. That's the purpose of Torah. That's what we're trying to do. That's the challenge. That's what it's all about. What was the sin of the spies? Fundamentally, it was a sin of viewing the world through a physical world lens. Go inspect the land. Look at the people. Look at the defenses. Examine the enemy. Scout out their weaknesses. And they come back. Well, the land is so formidable, and the fortifications are fearsome, and the fruits are cartoonishly large, and the people are big and strong. The land is unconquerable. What happened to this worldview where God is the only power? What happened to this worldview of the soul, where the physical reality is just a veneer, albeit a convincing veneer, a seamless veneer, an illusory world with lagless latency? that perspective was lost on the 10 spies. Joshua and Caleb, they remained citizens of the spiritual world. And they argued that, yes, the land and the people seem so powerful, but we have God on our side, and we'll carve them up like bread. They will offer as much real resistance as bread does to the knife. You're carving up bread. The only danger you face is if it's self-inflicted. The bread's not going to pounce on you. With God leading us, they're bread. That is the attitude of the citizen of heaven. And when the people favor the 10 over the 2, they chose to downgrade and to become citizens of the physical world and to forget about heaven. And therein lies the root of all the ills of the 9th day of Av. What is special about the land of Israel? Why is this such a central element, component of our religion, of our faith, of the Torah? The land of Israel is special because it is a physical land where the presence of God is most palpable. It's a physical land wherein becoming a citizen of heaven is easy. And in the land, there's the temple. And the temple was a locale where the presence of God, where the supremacy of God was palpable, was undeniable. It was a place of undeniable spirituality. It was special, yes. It contains all the vessels. It was a place of the annual pilgrimages. And when you got there, there was no doubt at all that this world, that this physical world is just a test. The Mishnah tells us that there were nature-defined miracles all the time in the temple. The presence of God was clear to all in the temple. It was an outpost of heaven here. When the people did the sin of the spies, when they accord prominence to physical realities over spiritual realities, that is grounds to lose your ability to see things the other way around, to lose the temple. The Kabbalists, do you have a little Kabbalistic spin to this? And they tell us that the Talmud reveals in the book of Menachos on page 29b that these two worlds are each epitomized with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. This world, the physical world, was created with the letter Hey. And next world, the spiritual world, was created with the letter Yud. And the Talmud explains why was this world created with the letter Hey, and why the world to come, the spiritual world, is created with the letter Yud. And the Talmud explains that the letter Yud is the most physically insignificant of the letters. Of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the smallest one, the one that's just a little dot, the one that's most insignificant physically, it's the most significant spiritually. And the Talmud tells us there are very few people, just as the letter Yud is the smallest, the cadre of people who accept the supremacy of the Yud worldview, of the spiritual worldview, it's going to be very small. What letter most symbolizes the supremacy of the world to come? The letter Yud. You recall perhaps, right before the episode of the spies, when Moshe nominated 12 men to go investigate the land, he renames Joshua. Joshua was previously called Hosea, and Moshe added a letter Yud to his name to make it Yehoshua. Joshua got the letter Yud, Rashi tells us, as a means to fend off the sin of the spies. The letter Yud is the preventative prophylactic against the sin of the spies. The sin of the spies is an event that happens when the nation forgets about the world to come, about the world of the letter Yud. When they forget about the supremacy of the world to come, of the spiritual world, and instead they see things as it appears to them on a surface level, on a physical level, on a mundane level, that's when they can make the terrible blunder and say, let's go back to Egypt. We can't enter the land. We'll all be slaughtered. The letter Yud represents the spiritual domain, the invisible domain, the world to come. And this realm is the domain of the select few. It's small, like the Yud. Not everyone understands this dimension. Not everyone is part of this special cohort, this special cadre. This is a Kabbalistic spin to this idea, but I think there's a very important lesson for us. In the calendar next week, we read that it's the 9th day of Av. And for the last 950 some odd years, it's been a day of fasting and mourning. And it's a 26-hour fast. And that's not because we're doing OMAD or trying to achieve ketosis. We're mourning the temple that was destroyed on this day. And unless it gets rebuilt by next week, millions of Jews worldwide will be fasting, no food, no drink, from sundown to nightfall to mourn the destruction. And we'll spend the day reading Lamentations and reciting elegies about the destruction of Jerusalem. And many perhaps may wonder, why does it still matter? The temple existed 1950 plus years ago. Why is that still important? And we understand on a fundamental level, the sin of the spies is the root, the spiritual roots of the day. And that warped worldview that takes the physical reality and says, this is what matters over the spiritual reality, that is a corruption of everything. And it's our responsibility to rectify the underlying cause. Our national mission is to restore the temple. But what does that mean? It means to restore the supremacy of that letter Yud, of that other world. To make the presence of God, to make that universal. To install that Yud, so to speak, everywhere. And the way to do that, our efforts to try to stem the tide, to reverse the consequences of this day, is to try to live a life where spirituality is more of a reality, where it's real, as much, if not more, than the physical reality. My grandfather, a blessed memory, used to say to his students, what is the overarching goal of all my messages to you, my students? The goal of it all is for you to recognize that the spiritual domain is real. That's what the spies got wrong, and that's what we need to rectify if we want to turn this day around. And this is easier said than done. And even people that are living an elevated life can fall prey to it. There's the old joke where the rabbi wakes up and he tells his wife something startling. I had a dream last night about God. And the wife says to him, well, what's the big deal? The Talmud tells us that what you think about during the day, that's going to be fodder for your dreams at night. So, of course you dream about God. So the rabbi says, no, that's the whole point. I'm so busy during the day. I wake up early to go pray Shacharis morning prayers. And then I have breakfast. And then after breakfast, I make the blessings before and the blessings after. And then I study Talmud for a few hours. And then I pray the afternoon prayer. And then I have lunch and we have the blessings before and after the meal. And then we have the afternoon study session. And then the dinner and the blessings and the evening prayers. My whole day is so busy. When do I have time to think about God? And that's the joke. But there's a shade of truth to it. We can live a life of total compliance of the laws of Torah. And we can study and pray with consistency and forget about this idea that the spiritual reality is supreme. And the physical reality is just a test. And you could do spiritual acts, but not really get it, not really think about it, not really live it, not really be a citizen of heaven. The word world, olam, literally means obscurity. We're fighting against the default status. The soul, it's invisible. The spiritual reality is invisible. God is invisible. These truths are being obscured. It's hard to do it. It's hard to try to live a life where spirituality is reality. Instead of that, all the things that don't matter, the things that are just the veneers, they capture all of our attention. So the Talmud says that this world's upside down. Everything's upside down. Because the things that truly matter, they're ignored. The people that have a yud attitude are vanishingly rare. Everyone else is living with the physical reality as dominant. And we're all guilty of this. But now's the time to try to do whatever we can to take a small step to try to become a citizen of heaven. As everyone knows, there's a war now happening in Israel. And there's so many different fronts. There's the Houthis in Yemen and Hamas, of course, and in Gaza and elsewhere. And there's the Hezbollah in the north and the Iranians and the Iraqis and all of Israel. And of course, all of us in the diaspora, we're on edge because Israel allegedly assassinated the leader of Hamas while he was in Tehran. And Iran is threatening to respond. And we're all consumed, I am at least, with the details, the missiles, the drones, the Houthis, the rockets. And I hate to say it, but I feel like I'm kind of processing it the way the spies did. What did the spies do? They looked at the bulging muscles and the giants of the fortified cities. The takeaway from the story of the spies is that the real determining factor of success and or failure, it's not the physical, it's the spiritual. If God is on our side, we'll carve them up like bread. And if he's not, we're toast. God ultimately runs the show. Everything else is a distraction. So again, I'm saying I'm guilty of this as much as anyone else is. This is what we're trying to fix. This perception that the physical reality is what determines the outcomes. We have the war, we have the election. How much of our energies does this consume? Right now, I'm in Canada for the summer. I tell you, I hear more Canadians talking about the American elections than I hear Americans talking about it. Now, of course, I know nothing about politics. I'm a total novice when it comes to matters of politics, but these Canadians, they're all experts. They're debating and analyzing and arguing. And of course, it's to what end? A citizen of heaven realizes it doesn't impact you. You can't even influence it. Yes, do your civic duty, you should vote. But ultimately, what matters, what's going to impact your soul forever, is studying some Torah, doing a mitzvah, helping others. We get consumed in the worldview of the spies. And now's the time to try to maybe change it a little bit, to move it in the opposite direction. So maybe one takeaway that we can do is to try to live a little bit less as a citizen of this world. My wife and I agreed to try to do at least a month without a smartphone, to disconnect a little bit from the physical world in hopes to hopefully deepen our association with the spiritual world. Whatever we can do to unwind and disentangle ourselves from the physical worldview from the worldview of those 10 spies and try to adopt the worldview of Joshua and Caleb, where God is the only power, where the spiritual is the real. That will hopefully make a small impact in trying to change the calculus. The sin of the spies still dominates the world around us. How do we know that? Because the temple has not been rebuilt. When we fundamentally reframe ourselves, our worldview, and adopt the perspective of Joshua and Caleb, and we do that as individuals and in mass, well, the consequences of that will go away. The temple will be rebuilt on the 9th day of Av. For thousands of years has been a day of mourning, will be turned into a holiday. Because we'll retroactively say, Joshua and Caleb were listening to you. And that will be a great act of recognition of the spiritual reality and a great triumph for our people. Who knows? Maybe we will be fortunate to witness that transformation one day. I appreciate your attention. I'm very excited, please God, to continue studying the book of Devarim with you as we approach the stretch run of year 8 of the Parsha podcast. And it's a great and happy and joyous day to know that, please God, year 9 of the Parsha podcast, we have a plan. We even have a theme. It's a lot to look forward to. I appreciate your time, your attention. Send me an email, rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. Have a wonderful day. All of us in the diaspora and, of course, our brothers and sisters in Israel, we shall be safe and happy and secure and strong. Our enemies should be destroyed. The light, the beacon of the people, be raised once again. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, an easy fast if we still have to fast next week. And please God, with the help of the Almighty, we'll talk again next week. The email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.